Hi, I'm Michelle Shingler, Editor-in-Chief of Foreword Reviews, and you're tuning into Petit Foreword, our bite-sized interviews with indie authors. Today we're speaking with Allyson Shaw, the author of Ashes and Stones, which releases from Pegasus on October 3rd. It's a consequential history text and a powerful travelogue that revisits the history of the witch trials in Scotland, and it stands to change the ways that people view those who were killed. Allyson, thank you for taking the time to speak with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Why were vulnerable women and women's friendships seen as so threatening by the societies that held the witch trials?
Well, focusing on Scotland, what was happening during the 16th, 17th, and early 18th centuries was a real spiritual overhaul of the Scottish Reformation. So, total change in the government and the church working together to institute what King James saw as his godly society, right? And John Knox was also the architect of that. And there were a lot of misogynistic ideas that painted women as the weaker sex. So if the devil was going to come for this beautiful Christian society they were building, they were going to go for the chink in the armor, which was women in their view. Also, vulnerable women were often, at that time, Scotland was an occupied territory. Women were relying on alms, who were widows who didn't have a man to protect them, perhaps, or who were disabled or elderly. Were often relying on charity and to break down neighborly networks in order to institute a societal change was to go for an easy target, the most vulnerable. And women's networks, women's friendships were not only functioning in that they produced fabric, they had children together, meaning helping each other give birth and take care of their children. So, along with those networks that underpinned the old society, right? There were also gossip networks, which wasn't like talking behind people's backs. It was actually sharing news, sharing information, perhaps debating ideas about even the price of beer and things like that. Well, all of that was broken down during this period in history, and neighbors were turned against each other. Women's friendships were turned against each other as they were asked during witchcraft interrogation to name names. So people began to suspect each other, were frightened of each other. Um, and this was part of kind of a divide and conquer technique of the Reformation.
You note that many of the monuments to the women murdered as witches are grotesque. Indeed, that those who murdered them are still telling their stories. What shape would a respectful monument take?
Well, I think we have quite a few examples in Scotland of beautiful local memorials, which I write about in the book. Like one of my favorites is the one in Forfar, which is a simple standing stone, a new one that's etched with the words "just people," and um, it's set beside the loch in a beautiful location that's actually mentioned in the trials in that area. We also have an incredible national monument in Norway, in Vardo, and this is the final sculpture of Louise Bourgeois. It is a profoundly beautiful kind of experience in a very rural, isolated Arctic location. Um, and I think that the challenge we actually face in Scotland is a clouding of memorial and witch tourism. These are an uneasy pairing. True memorial is a kind of a non-commercial endeavor, a space created for somber reflection, a public space. Uh, Whereas I think there's a confusion that if this is to take up public money and public space, it needs to be entertainment. It needs to generate the tourist dollar. Otherwise, it won't be worth it. So to have a memorial that is actually cashing in on the most sensationalized aspects of this history is to victimize these people yet again. And to put something in bronze that would be so grotesque. Like we have some monuments in Scotland that show the devil holding a little woman, right? Or like in Forest, an older sign that claims that women were rolled in spiked barrels down a hill and then burned. And that is actually not true. It's just a grotesque fiction. So these kind of sensationalistic messages are totally at odds with truly humanizing these women and giving them a and men as well. 15% of the accused were men. So giving them a dignified place in the public sphere.
Which of the women do you still think about the most and why? What about their stories stuck with you?
It's so tricky. I mean, there were 4,000 people, right? And so it's like 4,000 cold cases. And I think initially when I was writing the book, it was Isabel Gowdy who really haunted me. I mean, she left the most um, intricate and fascinating confessions. She was a storyteller. Every time I see a hare bounding across a field in Orkney where I live, I think of her. But I also, now that I live in Orkney, I think of Elspeth Rioch, who's the woman, the Orcadian woman tried in 1616 in Kirkwall, the city where I now live. Every day I walk past the cathedral where she was interrogated, and I share a landscape with her now. This woman who was a piper's daughter, a piper's daughter who was a wanderer from the Highlands. So she was an incomer, not considered a local. And she was caught up in the political machinations of the day and scapegoated. But she was also she was a teen mother and a rape survivor, but she was also a visionary. She really wanted to see as much as she could, both in this world and the other world beyond the veil. So she's a fascinating person whose life was much too short and that ended with such pain and violence. Yeah, so I think about her a lot.
Your book reveals that the lore of the trials and the subsequent executions is often embellished and exaggerated. What do you attribute that impulse to when the stories themselves are horrifying in their own right?
Yeah, I think there's two things that um, are going on. It to embellish these fictions to kind of like in the Holyrood Palace where the royal family, when they're in Scotland, that's where they stay. Um, there's a ghost called Bald Agnes, who's Agnes Sampson, a spaewife or healer from Haddington. She's bald because she was shaved during her interrogations to search for the mark. So this distortion completely glosses over that they're referring in a grotesque way to her tortures. Now, stories like this by the hundreds keep ghost tours in business, right? So there's they're lucrative despite the dehumanizing cruelty that they perpetuate. I think it's easier to trivialize than to mourn, and that is really something that those of us who live in Scotland and love Scotland need to really grapple with that. um, I also find the current vogue of witch fiction troubling in that it will often actually use not only the real trials transcripts, but the real names of people who died, but then give them kind of exceptional superhuman powers or um and this really clouds things in that people I think are actually confused about whether these women were witches or not. Because of the plethora of witch fiction which describes them as magical beings or exceptional healers that had such power that they were targeted. That's really overtaken the truth, and my book really is trying to set the record straight.
Yeah, you bring the humanity back to them so wonderfully.
Thank you.
What do you think the contemporary corollaries of the witch hunt are, and how should we confront them?
Well, I think that anytime we see bigotry being preached from the pulpit, we're dangerously close to a kind of clearance operation like we saw in Scotland. So the alliance of the church and state, which in the United States, you have this, it's in theory a separation of church and state. Yet in Scotland, um, we're still under a Christian, under the um, so called Christian state. So this is something I think where you see the Christian right in the rise in the United States, the really uncomfortable kind of Christianizing of the Supreme Court. Um, and we really need to be ever vigilant against the scapegoating of the most vulnerable uh, in society by bigotry at the pulpit.
That's absolutely true. What are you working on next?
So, my next book is a sister to Ashes and Stones, but it'll be exploring the Northern Isles, which is Orkney and Shetland. I live in Orkney now, and um, there's a distinct character to the islands in that they belonged to Norway until the 15th century. And so there's a real Norse feeling around this place. And the witch hunts, while not as virulent as they were in mainland Scotland, have a really fascinating history. And I'm looking forward to kind of focusing in on a smaller landscape that actually is really dear to my heart. And in the confessions, you do find a lot of the landscape mentioned, and this is an ancient place full of hollow hills, which are like portal tombs, right? But before modern archaeology, they were thought of as home to Troes or otherworldly beings, things like that. So the stories around the landscape that are mentioned in contemporary folklore, meaning contemporary to the witch hunts, um, I still can share there. I can still crawl in these hollow hills and things like that. So there's a real vibrancy to I think the stories that can be told about this place, and I'm really looking forward to writing about them.
That's really exciting. We'll really look forward to that. This book is such a gift. Thank you, Allyson. To our audience, don't forget to pick up this illuminating book on October 3rd. You really don't want to miss it. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.